Good evening and welcome. I think this is the third or the fourth session of the philosophy research discussions, where I'm chatting about stuff to do with, or loosely related to, Adam Curtis's recent documentary series Can't Get You Out of My Head, which has proven to be an interesting kind of experiment. So the idea here, if you're not familiar, is this is a process of doing philosophy in public. I teach with the Free University of Brighton. There's a course coming up there. There's some details coming up below about that. So I teach philosophy with the Free University of Brighton, and obviously I teach courses that have specific length of time. So the next one starts in May. It's 10 weeks long, and I teach on Monday nights. And since COVID, I've used Twitch to do the lectures, and then we have Zoom seminars. But in between classes, what I do is I have a Monday night philosophy session where essentially I talk about my philosophical work that week and use it as a kind of space to talk through some of the ideas, partly to myself and obviously to anyone else that's interested, some of the ideas that I was thinking about working with that week. So it's a kind of research update for myself. It's a kind of space to explore some of the thoughts. It's not a teaching space. This is a kind of conversational space where, as I say, it's kind of trying to attempt to do philosophy in public. So, to the topic at hand, Adam Curtis, Can't Get You Out of My Head, a documentary that's proven to be quite a challenge, actually, to watch. So last week, as some of you might know, I didn't feel up to doing philosophy in public. I didn't have, as I put it at the time, the hubris available. I didn't feel comfortable. And I think it's interesting to kind of reflect upon, for me at least, why that was. Now, partly it's just sometimes seasonal and sometimes like the cycles of someone's mood, but it's also because actually watching Adam Curtis's work is quite a challenge. I don't necessarily mean that on a kind of intellectual sense. I'm not talking about that in an abstract sense, but I'm talking about the continuous bombardment of imagery and a narrative that makes you feel a particular way. And it's very difficult sometimes for us to acknowledge, I think, that thought is not impersonal in the sense that, or rather, because I don't think right, I think thought is in many ways impersonal, or transpersonal, or beyond the individual, but it's embodied. It comes with a kind of feeling, and it comes with a kind of a sentiment or an emotional, or what we sometimes might call an affect, a kind of a mood attached to it. I think that's the best way of thinking about it. So thinkers have a kind of mood in which that thought takes place. And this isn't a kind of happy, but it's rather that in order to think a particular kind of thought, in order to try and access a certain sort of philosophical set of conceptual constructions and connections, which is kind of what we do when we do philosophy. We try and work certain concepts into various kind of connections. But in order to do that, you have to kind of enter a space that isn't flat. It isn't neutral. Each space has its own kind of topography, but most importantly, it has a kind of mood. And so sometimes that mood is one of being clinical and scientific. Sometimes that mood is one of being poetic and joyful and creative. Sometimes that mood is one of anger, sometimes of sadness. And I think the mood around Curtis is itself an interesting thing to think about. Now, I mentioned before that one of the reasons I'm kind of thinking with and against and inside of the work that Curtis has done is that I take Curtis to be articulating what we might call the classical liberal mentality at the moment. And I don't mean that to be an insult. I'm a revolutionary, I'm a communist, and so obviously I'm not a liberal in that sense, and so I have a different kind of perspective and a different kind of attitude towards the world. But the liberal attitude towards the world, the liberal democratic attitude, let's say, is perhaps the most widespread, and it's taken to be the mainstream. So extremism, for example, is only extreme in relationship to this kind of mainstream, this main dominant sort of mode of thinking, which is the liberal democratic. And the liberal democratic takes things like democracy and the individual and national sovereignty and all these kind of things as part of its common sense. These are for it almost kind of natural facts of the world. And so one of the things that Curtis is kind of articulating, and it begins to be very clear actually towards the end of episode 6, where he explicitly kind of states this. So this is about 1:30 or so in an hour and 30 into that episode. One of the things that's kind of clear is that I think Curtis is reflecting on, articulating in a kind of thought about the world from this perspective of a liberal democrat, if you like. I mean, someone who thinks it's possible for the world to be organised according to reasonable common sense, liberal democracy, voting once every few years, all these kind of things, media, free press, open press, all this kind of stuff. Now, one of the things that's implicit inside the liberal kind of mindset, the liberal democratic mindset, is that there's a kind of unity there. In other words, what I mean by that is that despite conflicting interests, in the end they can all be brought together if we have enough conversation, enough discussion, and if there's enough checks and balances, and we can, as it were, balance the different conflicting interests in society, because in the end those conflicting interests aren't what I would call incommensurable. In other words, they are not in and of themselves so radically opposed to each other as to be unable to ever reach a kind of recognition or compromise. And that latter position of the incommensurable notion of certain interests in society is the one that we would take, and I would take, from Marxism, in which the idea of class struggle or class war or class conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, these are both classes produced by the capitalist system, but they are produced as it were as inverses of each other. No possibility of reconciliation. And so the liberal is quite different. There is always for the liberal a kind of possibility of recognition and reconciliation, a kind of balance that's and harmony that's possible to establish. Whereas for a Marxist or a communist, that notion is radically wrong, radically an illusion. And so I don't want to kind of simply dismiss Curtis and go, well, look, you're obviously just a liberal with this false narrative. But what I do want to do is note that his articulation of the difficulties inside the social political system that we have at the moment come from within that perspective, come from within that liberal democratic perspective. And he's attempting in a very interesting way, I think, and I do think it's interesting, he's attempting to try and think about the loss of control within a society of control. So within a society in which that individual is increasingly controlled by what he calls at one point algorithmic governance. So that would be the idea that society is increasingly moving towards being governed by huge data sets, big IT, AI, and this kind of what he calls algorithmic governance is not even in control of. It's not even a tool in the hands of the bankers or the ruling class. It's simply a tool that begins to generate its own dynamic and impose itself on society, and this is the kind of situation we find ourselves in, where this increasingly inhuman process of control and management is being imposed, and in being imposed, the individual, the human, finds themselves increasingly out of control, loss of control, that kind of sense. And so that, I think, is a kind of important element for us to think about in terms of political philosophy and in terms of political theory at the moment, because I think it speaks to, I mean, obviously on the one hand it's kind of speaking to the idea of agency, where we might find political agency in this sort of situation, where we might find a capacity for us to, feel like we can change the world, and actually have an effect to that end. But the problem with agency is it and the problem of framing things in terms of agency is it kind of brings in this intention behind it. So the agent has something that they want to achieve, an intention, and their agency is encountered in the process of trying to fulfill this goal that they have. Whereas one of the things that seems to be interesting from one of the things that Curtis is talking about is those notions of intentions and goals have sort of begun to dissipate or begun to become far less coherent, far less easily believable, and so what you might sort of think is, well, isn't that then the root of our sort of sense of loss of control, loss of agency, just as it were, to believe again in the world, to believe again in some possibility of changing it. But one of the things that Curtis is doing, which I think is interesting, is introducing this non-human element of the algorithmic government, as though a process is out of control, as though a process is taking place which we may have sort of set in motion, but no longer have any kind of control over. And now, one of the things that's interesting about that is that element of the process that's we might have started, but is now out of control. Oh, sorry, is the sound a bit dodgy? Yeah, maybe check cables. Oh, it's this new NVIDIA RTX. Let me just see if I can flick it off that. Yeah, let's see if we can flick that RTX off. Let's keep that. Hopefully that's changed the sound a little bit. Yes, sorry, that's possibly a crappy RTX add-on that was then not working. I thought that was meant to be very good, but obviously it's not. Thank you very much for that, Machinators. Hopefully it's improved. We'll see. Where's this desktop audio? Maybe change that down. So where was I? Yes. So this sense of something that's got out of control, something that is a process that we started, but that's now sort of taking over us. One of the things that Sorcerer's Apprentice. This is the Sorcerer's Apprentice kind of, or the Mephistophelian, the Faust moment. One of the things that's interesting, obviously, is well, not obviously, but one of the things that's interesting, if you're not familiar with this, is that maybe check cables. It's not your end. No, is it still shitty? I wonder what the hell that is. Bad sound. Bit rate's good. Can hear you though. Oh dear. Let me just have a quick squiz. Oh dear. That is unfortunate. I don't like bad sound. I wonder if I've got this one off. Let's mark that down. Okay. I don't like bad sound. I'm really sorry about that. That's one of the reasons I got this decent mic. I must have fiddled. Sounds like rain. Okay. Cable checks. Yes. Oh no. Oh dear. I hate that. Oh dear. Yes. Someone said yes. Oh, something's gone. Maybe there was a bad sound. Right. So where was I? So the Sorcerer's Apprentice. Yes. So that Sorcerer's Apprentice notion, that's one of the things that's interesting, is that Sorcerer's Apprentice, that Faust complex, set a process in motion by human hands, but then it kind of folds back on the human and takes over you, which is very much, I think, part of what Curtis is describing there is central to what Marx is also describing. I mean, that's one of the fascinating things about the notion of capitalism that Marx talks about is... For Marx, the capitalist is as trapped in the system as we are, as proletarians, as workers. They don't get to control the system. Capital itself controls the system. Capital drives, or has a kind of drive to expansion and accumulation and a particular kind of way of reproducing itself that the capitalist has to follow. And if they don't, then they're as screwed as everybody else. And you can kind of understand that on a relatively straightforward basis, which is take two companies producing a product, and someone comes along with a way of producing that product cheaper, making more profit, but it involves doing something that is, let's say, not particularly pleasant. So it involves maybe adding an element of danger into the working environment. Or it involves adding an element of socially negative dynamic into society. So cars and petrol or whatever. You can't simply get a compact and an agreement at which the capitalists go, oh, we're not going to do that. That's not particularly good for society, because the problem is the profit is still there to be made, and so someone else can come along and just utilise that. And that there's like a push. There's like a push dynamic in that situation, in which once that opportunity is kind of, made capable of being able to operate, it's the opportunity itself that drives the dynamic rather than the individuals behind it. And the individuals can obviously moderate that a little bit. They can counteract that, but they're no longer in full control of that, because at any point some other person can come along and slide into that situation and take advantage of the opportunity. And so these models, both Curtis and Marx in a sense, are trying to do something really interesting, which is they're trying to, and this is much clearer in a sense in Marx. One of the reasons I like Marx, one of the things they're trying to do is they're trying to suggest that there are processes within which the human operates that are abstract from the human and are not, in a sense, completely capable of being controlled. Now, we kind of know this because obviously we assume and we work within a sense of nature, or at least most of us do, the natural world, in which we're not in charge of that, and we I just banged my mic, so let's hope that didn't make it a problem. But we work with a process in which we're not in charge. We know that there's a kind of relationship in which if we don't, as it were, bend a little bit, if we don't have flexibility, if we try and impose our will upon the ocean as a sailor, then we're going to get bitten hard and probably not survive. And so we have a kind of, sometimes it's called a respect, sometimes it's a sort of a kind of a way of thinking about the world in which other forces are bigger than us. Other things are bigger than us, other things have got their own kind of dynamics, but it's a way of thinking about our relationship to the world in which it's not about agency. It's not simply about what I want and how I get it. Rather, it's a process of negotiation. And it's a process of negotiation between human and non-human elements. And I think this is one of the things that Curtis is introducing in his work. The non-human element for him is artificial intelligence, the data gathering, the surveillance society, and these kind of notions of behaviorism behind it. And I'll talk a little bit about behaviorism later. And so he's trying to introduce this kind of non-human element into it. But as it were, it's a kind of introduction of the non-human element from within this liberal paradigm, in which there's not an inherent conflict between different elements of political society, and at the same time, without acknowledging or even thinking about the way in which Marx has already precisely introduced the idea of this non-human element in the idea of capitalism, this thing that sucks out the life of the human. And so I think it's this relationship between the human and the non-human. And I want to use the word non-human for now, simply because I don't want to talk too easily about the natural, because I think the non-human includes both what we might think of as the natural world, but also the unnatural world, the supernatural world, the transnatural world, the artificial world, the technological world. A whole series of worlds, if you like, that begin to generate their own dynamics. And this relationship to the world as a kind of negotiation between the human and other non-human elements, I think, is fundamental to us beginning to reconceive of not just politics, but the social itself, and in a sense, thought itself, in such a way that we might begin to make progress rather than go around in circles. Now, how do you deal with the non-human world? I mean, And here I'm going to speak to Machinatus a little bit, in terms of a response he made to me a couple of weeks ago, a video response, and a couple of thoughts that came out from that were really useful and really interesting. So first of all, I mean, just as a sort of side note, almost as a kind of an aside, he noted, and I think it's crucially important, that for me, sorcery, political activism and philosophy are all kind of part of one element of work. They're all entwined in such a way that it's difficult for me to disentangle the one from the other. I don't really separate out. Obviously, I'm aware of spaces in which I'm doing the one at the forefront rather than the other. But sorcery and political activism and philosophy are all kind of part of an attempt, as it were, by me to feel my way around the world. And that attempt to feel my way around the world, that attempt to feel my way into a space that I can enjoy and that I can, get pleasure from, and that I can learn from, and that I can grow within, and that I can, these are all kind of techniques that complement each other. Now, for a lot of people, it's probably quite reasonable, I would say, to sort of say what's kind of common to all these elements of sorcery, political activism, and to a certain extent my interest or my particular take inside philosophy. What's common to all of those is what might negatively be called an irrationalism, or perhaps a I mean, that's often associated with quite problematic kind of notions, but at least a sense in which reason is not God. It's not dominant. It's not capable of having complete control. And so, so all of them, I think. I mean, and I think there's a sense in which that's true, but I myself would describe it as a sense, that these elements of sorcery, political activism, and philosophy are actually. They're not really to do with being irrational, but they're to do with being concrete. They're to do with being practical, in a sense. They're to do with trying to acknowledge that when we're worried about truth, this is not something that necessarily generates from some obscure issue. Quite often the worry about truth comes because people lie and we can't work out how to deal with the lies. Or when we're worried about beauty, it might be because we can't quite work out why our experience of a riverbank seems to be close to our experience of a Rothko, and so how are these kind of things kind of connected, and what am I kind of doing in there? How do I feel in those kind of relationships? So that the connections between those are often to do with trying to much more practically and in experience negotiate the world. But there was another element of Machinatus' comments that I thought were really useful, and it referred to the methodology. So one of the things that he had done was to take the "can't get you out of my head" and to apply what we might call an algorithmic method to it, and to use an anagram process of establishing a kind of series of anagrams that came out, and then to use a kind of intuitive process to kind of pick on some of those anagrams as having a way of sparking a thought, sparking a kind of connection. And it reminded me very much of a process that is in the background of some of my sorcery work. So my sorcery work often derives from chaos magic, and in the background there's a whole series of different people that are kind of drawn on, thought about, talked about, and central perhaps to many of chaos magicians is the work of William Burroughs and Brian S. Gysin. And in both of those situations, they use these very interesting processes to try and enable us to kind of loosen up our thought and create new connections, to produce new sparks that can light a fire. And in particular, they use cut-ups, and they use a kind of algorithmic poetics process. There's some really, really beautiful poems by Gysin, by Brian Gysin, that are made by taking a particular line, a single line of poetry, and then just almost algorithmically, step by step, rearranging all of the words in every different position they can possibly go into. And so the sentence mutates through these different sort of settings and organisations. And there's a couple of things that I always loved about that. One was you would come up with these incredibly beautiful sort of extra lines, these other moments, and that in itself is an interesting kind of like result. But one of the other results would be that you would actually begin to see the sentence almost unfold itself. And you'd almost be able to see the DNA of the sentence unfold itself, and all these other meanings that were kind of connected in unconsciously or subconsciously or implicitly, and that would give the original sentence, it would transform it from being an original sentence to being one part of a much, much wider body. So instead of being a kind of origin moment, that original sentence that was then transformed by the rearrangement of the words into every possible order would actually produce this sense that original sentence was itself just one particular arrangement. And it would in a sense it would kind of make all of the different elements, all the different possible arrangements in one sense equal, but in another sense it would allow the varying intensities to actually begin to show themselves, in the same way that you might find that there's a kind of sort of different hues in colours, and so it would enable all those various different intensities to show themselves, and some of them, like what we would think of as that original sentence, would still maintain the intensity they had, but others would also begin to get intensities, as it were, imbued in them, expressed through them. And so this speaks to something that Deleuze and Guattari were really, really interested in their work, which was something that Deleuze drew from Bergson, but both Deleuze and Guattari were really interested in their schizoanalytic work, which is the idea that instead of focusing on what they call extensities, things that we can quantify, things that we can put into, as it were, a kind of spatial arrangement, one of the things they were really interested in was the development of idea of intensities. This kind of, and the intensity is not just a kind of quality. Well, at one point Deleuze talks about an intensity, let's say the intensity of the degree of a temperature. This is an intensity. So 20 degrees C is a different intensity from 0 degrees C. But these are not intensities that are, as it were, now, I mean, this is difficult. They are moments of singularity, and intensity is a moment of singularity, but a moment of singularity that has a kind of multiplicity within it, and so it has a huge kind of depth to it. Intensities have these depth. They're not like flat on the surface. There's not a sense in which you can easily compare and say, well, 0 degrees is essentially the same as 20 degrees plus. These are, they're not on the same scale, whilst they are at the same time on the same scale. And so it's that kind of comparisons of difference, that kind of relationship between differences, that is part of what interests them. And I think this is, in a sense, part of what is being pursued inside Curtis. He's trying to pursue, in a kind of way, I think, these varying intensities that we're encountering. I think one of the difficulties that he has is that he's trying to pursue these intensities, these sort of senses of, what it's like to be in 2020, what it's like to be in a post-Brexit moment, what it's like to be in this particular sort of situation, what it's like to be. The question, becomes very important. But one of the ways he's trying to pursue these intensities is by establishing these kind of narratives, these historical narratives that are kind of grounded in almost, people doing things, agencies, agents acting. And I think the two things don't work well together. And I think this is one of the reasons why it can be quite undermining. It can feel quite difficult to watch Curtis, because whilst he begins to pinpoint some of those intensities with an enormous poetic accuracy, he's at the same time pursuing this idea that there's a kind of narrative of explanation, but a narrative that continually fails, or that continually pushes us into a situation in which we lose our agency. So we have this kind of strange sense in which there's a truth to what he's saying, which comes, I think, from the intensities that he points towards, these kind of moments, like that moment early on where he's talking about the woman who goes through the divorce proceedings, and you know, she has to be cruel to be free, she has to be ruthless to be free, so that's a kind of moment of an intensity there that we can kind of encounter, and we can encounter almost the whole of the women's liberation movement, you know, from the 60s onwards, that in that moment, that kind of multiplicity of all kinds of things kind of compressed into that crystal. And so we can kind of encounter that as true, and at the same time it's placed within this narrative framework in which, you know, the explanation you know, for our difficulties, or our sense of lack of control, is given in terms of this historical narrative driven by agents that are maybe carrying out sort of actions that have unintentional consequences, but, you know, it's essentially driven by these kind of agents of power. And I think that kind of almost cognitive dissonance between the moments of intensity that feel, you know, true, to use that word, and this narrative that feels disempowering, makes me feel disempowered, unable to do anything, unable to understand, unable to work out why I shouldn't simply disagree and give in. And it was interesting this week for me to look at that last moment in episode 6 of Curtis, in which he tries to almost reclaim his narrative. He tries to almost reclaim it for agency, reclaim it for the self, reclaim it for the individual, in a way that was quite curious. And I kind of want to come on to that in a second. One of the things that I've been working on, before we get to that kind of last moment in what Curtis is trying to do, one of the things I've been working on, and I spoke a bit about this a while back, is I've been working on this text by Foucault and Binswanger called A Dream and Existence. And it's a really strange and curious text, and I'm going to continue to work on it for a bit. At the heart of this text is this conversation about the dream and about images. And I think part of the reason I'm interested in this text, and part of the reason I think it connects with the Curtis, is because Curtis's methodology is to kind of mobilize images almost in a dreamlike way. And I think there's some really, really interesting ideas inside that text that I think are worth kind of considering. So there's two that I really want to push at, and that I will kind of keep coming back to, I think, over the next little while, until I can work out quite what I think about them, and until they've essentially done their work, or I've done my work with them. And one of them is Foucault's introduction to the text, and it comes about in terms of what he's discussing the dream, and he's discussing the imagination, and for him the dream is not something that is processing stuff that's already happened, and it's not saying that it doesn't do that sometimes, but it's not fundamentally a way of processing stuff that's already happened. It's not fundamentally a way of processing stuff that's outside. Fundamentally, he suggests the dream is the first moment of freedom. And he connects this to the notion of an image as also being kind of the first sort of opening up of freedom. This is Foucault. During the dream, the movement of imagination is directed towards the primary moment of existence, where the original constitution of the world is achieved. Now, when trying to grasp this movement within the constituted world, waking consciousness provides it with the lines of an almost perceived space as coordinates, and presses it towards a quasi-presence of the image. In short, the authentic current of the imagination is reversed, and against the dream itself, images are put in its place. So, what he's talking about is so this is, in other words, during the dream, the movement of imagination is directed towards the primary moment of existence where the original constitution of the world is achieved. So the idea here is that this world around us that we're perceiving and operating in, the world constituted by a kind of negotiation between what we can see, how we think of things, and the world itself giving us a feedback. The production of that world, the production of the kind of the idea that it's even a world, this moment of constitution is arising from. There is an element in which it arises from within human. It's not produced from the human. It's not like I decide what the world is, but without the kind of bringing together of elements in a particular kind of way, the world does not become the world, or a world does not become a world. And so I kind of have a role, maybe like a conductor, maybe like a collagist, in which I'm kind of putting together certain elements that I encounter, maybe physiologically or biologically, but I'm putting together some of those elements in a particular kind of way. And the dream is, as it were, as he says, this kind of process in which that putting together process, it's like bubbling away. It's fully at work. It's this primary moment of constituting, organising, connecting, putting into the same frame the various different elements. So it's not a dealing with the past primarily. It's not a dealing with trauma. It's not a dealing with like unconscious wishful fulfillments and all these kind of things. Rather, it's this kind of process of putting together, this process of constituting. But what then happens is that the image becomes a kind of fixed element, and so instead of the process of putting together, the process of framing, the process of constituting, continuing in its aliveness, continuing in its fluidity, continuing in its contingency, in its capacity to be rearranged, and continuing to, as it were, allow our play to be purposeful in that sense, to have an effect. What begins to happen instead is that an image begins to be formed. We begin to, it's as though we move from the process of painting to the fixed painting itself, and then we take the fixed painting to be what the process of painting is. And so we end up with this kind of damaged relationship to the world, where we take the world to be fixed. And it's interesting that right at the end, this is exactly what Curtis is trying to do when he refers to Graeber. He refers precisely to Graeber's statement, which is not really Graeber's statement. I mean, this is a kind of a relatively common statement, or a relatively familiar statement. That is not to take anything away from David Graeber, who was a very interesting person, but it's not. This is not an uncommon thought amongst anarchist and communist circles. And the thought is that we are the ones that make the world, and therefore we are the ones we have the capacity to remake the world. And that relationship between that capacity to make and that kind of fixity that we get stuck in, I think, is this is what Binswanger and Foucault are talking about in their particular text. But this, I think, is also crucially, in a sense, what Curtis is trying to do, I think, with this problematic narrative that comes from being within the liberal framework. And there's as evidence to sort of support that, there is a which I can sort of dig up and put onto Discord. There's a really interesting piece that Curtis has in. Let me just look at it here. That it's in, if I remember rightly, Art Forum or some sort of art paper. Here it is. God, I did have it in my notes here, but now it seems to have sort of gone somewhere else. Adam Curtis, yeah, it's in Art Forum. So this is Art Forum. This is an online journal for artists and art critics and all that kind of stuff. It's April 2021, and it's a top 10 from Adam Curtis. And what he introduces there are 10 different things that he thinks, as it were, enable us to recreate or rebuild or refine that constitutive element that we have in our relationship to the world. So again, it's not that we make the world in the way that we feel like, rather that we have an active role in, as it were, which elements we bring together and which produce for us the world. And he has this like really interesting list. This is Curtis. So he has an episode of South Park called Imagination Land. He has a couple of figures from people like Alicia Ball and James Hinton, and he goes through like 10 of these different. He refers to a book that I really actually want to read now called A Glastonbury Romance by John Cowper Powys. And I won't go through them all, but there's a whole bunch of these really interesting sort of prompts as to what you might want to look at, what you might want to follow up on, what you might want to try and experience if you were interested in this, in recovering the joy of play and experimentation in making the world around you, the constitutive role that you can have. And I think that really speaks to me. That's kind of part of what Curtis is trying to do, to try and recover this constitutive element, this sense of our capacity to make the world and remake the world. And I don't probably repeating endlessly now that he'd do much better if he was to engage with a little bit of Marxism here, and if he was to engage perhaps with a kind of slightly different relationship to the subject as well. And this goes off, as it happens, into a whole kind of interesting tangent when you're talking about these kind of the role of the dream, as it were, to constitute a world. One of the things that then begins to be interesting is a question of what does it mean to dream, and what does it mean to awaken, and what does it mean to awaken from a dream. And there's some really interesting stuff in the Foucault and Binswanger that goes all the way back and draws all the way back on philosophers such as Heraclitus, in which one of the things that awakening from the dream kind of involves is, in a sense, awakening to a communal world, awakening to a collective world. So moving beyond being more than an individual, realizing, as it were, that you're in this negotiated relationship, that you're in this kind of common space. This is, as it were, part of the way in which Heraclitus and, as I say, sort of Foucault and Binswanger are talking about this. This is part of the way in which certain sorts of philosophers consider awakening to be best understood. So you can be dreaming whilst awake if you live in a situation in which essentially your opinion is the one that matters, your thoughts are the one that matters, and you're kind of living in this situation in which you are the only thing inside your world. That in itself is, for a lot of philosophers, is a kind of dreamlike state. And so awakening is awakening to this kind of common logos sometimes. Now, the difficulty always in these kind of situations of like, as it were, wondering how much emphasis I should put on my own capacity to make the world, and how much I should accept the world as others make it for me and with me. That kind of, the world out there, is that the most important thing, or is the world that I'm projecting the most important thing? One of the difficulties is in trying to not end up on one side or the other of that, and to try and end up with some sort of relationship of negotiation, because a relationship that's kind of the basis of language in many ways, and the relationship of kind of a kind of common co-production. That relationship is actually far more complicated, I think, than most of us give credit for. Not least because it's far more difficult to listen and to hear than most of us, I think, actually realise. It's much easier to hear what I want to, or hear what I think someone is saying, than to actually hear what they are saying. So I'm going to pursue some of that a little bit more, and I think what I'm actually going to do in terms of that is probably do a little bit of work in terms of sort of moving from Curtis and coming back to him in a little while. But before the next course begins, I'm probably going to move to a little bit of a sort of more academic presentation of some of that stuff in Foucault and Binswanger. So that's possibly what I'm going to be doing over the next couple of weeks, depending upon where obviously I go. But that's my thought this week, is that I should be doing a little bit more of that. But for today, I just wanted to finish with one last bit, this kind of moment of agency, this moment of Curtis trying to recover our capacity as individuals and humans, as he keeps saying, within the narrative. And it's interesting who the enemy is here. I mean, it's interesting to think about who Curtis thinks is, as it were, the main source of the problem. And the main source of the problem definitely seems to be behaviorism in psychology and Skinner. And I'll just bring up a little bit of that's very I'll just bring up a little bit of what he's saying here. Let's just play this. So this is right towards the end of episode 6. So it's right towards the end. This is kind of the last move that Curtis is making, and I think it sort of begins from this 50 years ago. And it's interesting that he pops this little title up. It kind of almost indicates this is the sort of origins of it, even though everything else is kind of going from the 70s onwards. But this kind of indicates an origin of it. So I'm just gonna let's just pop the desktop audio on.
50 years before, an American psychologist called B.F. Skinner had become notorious when he had outlined just such a society. Skinner had shown how he could easily alter the behaviour of animals, like pigeons, by using a simple system of rewards. He called it operant conditioning.
In this experiment, he must peck at the cross 10 times before the food is forthcoming. After 4 or 5 sessions, the pigeon learns the routine perfectly and pecks at the cross wherever he sees it, without being in the least upset at being made to work for his living.
Now that produces in a rat or a pigeon or a monkey and in a man a very high rate of activity. And if you build up, you can get enormous amounts of behavior out of these organisms for very little pay. You don't need to give them very much to induce a lot of that. Now, a world in which a great many productive things occur on this schedule would be a wonderful world.
Skinner wrote a novel called Walden 2 that described a future utopia where all human behavior would be controlled through this kind of operant conditioning. It was a utopia, he said, because it would free society from all the dangerous and irrational impulses inside individuals' minds. All of that could be sealed off by managing people's behavior with rewards and treats.
So this process that Skinner develops, sometimes called positive reinforcement, I think very badly, but what Skinner himself calls it is operant conditioning, and Curtis, indicates this. This process is really hated inside psychology. It's played a really, behaviorism has played a very, very sort of weird role, from what I understand and from my research inside psychology. And it plays a very bad role. For example, in the 60s and early 70s, a whole lot of psychology is responding and reacting to behaviorism. It's trying to, as it were, break away from behaviorism, and behaviorism is I think too often caricatured. On the basis that it kind of removes the human. It talks simply about behavior. It talks simply about the observable behavior. It doesn't want to impute anything to the black box. It doesn't want to have any theory about what's going on inside the human mind. It simply wants to deal with what can be observed, in stimulus and response. What can be observed, what behaviors can actually be seen outside and as it were, in the collective space. And it sort of wants to put aside this sense of, the inner space being the most important. And that's, methodologically speaking, that is in fact how behaviorism operates. But there's actually a lot. I think there's a lot that depends upon the framing of this. And one of the things that's really interesting about the way that Curtis frames it is it's often framed in terms of a control mechanism, and possibly quite rightly, it's framed in such a way because it's often been used as a kind of control mechanism. It's been used to develop control mechanisms. And so we have this kind of dialogue in which something like behaviorism denies the inner life of the human, and simply wants to operate in terms of external behaviors that can be then controlled almost behind our backs. And so real psychology, real psychoanalysis, anyone with any sort of real soul is actually going to pay attention to the inner workings of the human mind and all the experiences and the phenomenology of life that comes around from that. And that's really what we're going to deal with, and we're going to do that because it's not manipulative, it's not about control, it's about expression and all these kind of things. And the difficulty is that latter form of psychology, I think, has actually developed far more pernicious kind of modes of operation, because what it begins to do is it begins to separate out that individual as the sole person responsible. So the individual becomes, as it were, their behaviours, and they become responsible for all of their behaviours. And in doing so, what we actually do is we kind of we fail to acknowledge that we are subject to our behaviours as much as we are agents of them. We are no longer given any space in which we can kind of feel ourselves in tension with our bodies, in tension with our biologies, in which there's negotiated processes. We become rather somehow, capable of being taught management techniques, breathing techniques, mindfulness techniques. So if something's going wrong in our behaviours, in our external world, then it must be something going wrong inside. And because it's in something inside, we have ultimate control over it, and we're obviously we're obviously failing somehow to, learn the proper lessons. We're obviously failing somehow to deal with fucked up traumas or whatever, and we should do the work here. What has happened, I think, is that we've become privatized in that kind of mode, and we've become the people to blame, and essentially there's this location of blame. And there's this real difficulty at this point, because in a sense, one of the things that Skinner is doing is saying, in a sense, that much of how we behave is not really it's not really capable of being subject to sort of simple internal control. It's a kind of relationship between an input and an output, and a kind of route that we can take. And so if for example, you are given certain sorts of options, but other options are removed, then you become responsible for the choices that you make, but you never get to be responsible for the possibilities that were given to you in the first place. No one acknowledges that the establishment of those choices isn't something that we as an individual can ever set up. We are faced with Sophie's choices, if you like, and yet somehow we're then made to sort of behave or think that somehow we're the person that can kind of created those choices, and that we have a free rein in the creation of choices. And this speaks to the idea of capitalism, which basically puts us back into a world and points us back to a world in which many of the choices that we are, presented with, aren't choices that we created. They are creating us, as it were, by being imposed upon us in the very same way that when we have a general election, we have this ridiculous notion that somehow we're given a choice between Labour and the Conservative, we're free to starve any way we like. Yes, exactly. We're free to starve any way we like. We're free to starve, in this particular way or that particular way, but we're not free to actually grow food in land that's plainly, not being used, and to just, do something sensible about, the world around us. And so it's kind of curious that what we have is this and I think it needs to kind of be disentangled. I think this is kind of, in a sense, we have this kind of this evil figure of behaviorism that denies the human, against which the human must resist, and yet that narrative is actually played out in such a way that the human that resists this evil behaviorist is now made responsible for all of the problems. And society and the setup and the framework and the systems, all of this becomes kind of slid away. It becomes kind of put aside. And in doing so, I think we actually fail to be able to acknowledge that very lesson that Curtis wants to point us to at the end about Graeber, about the fact that we make the world and we can remake it, because it fails to point us to the fact that, as it were, the world is not a fixed place, and the very choices that we are given are not a fixed set of choices. There's a kind of history, a relationship of power and setup that has presented those choices to us. And if we want to behave differently, if we want to be different, then we need to rearrange the framework in which we have options. Quite often, I think the best way of thinking about why someone has done what they've done is not what they wanted to do, it's what options did they have. I think the first question to always ask when you think about why someone has behaved in a particular way is not to think, well, what kind of person are they? What kind of character do they have? What kind of behaviours have they developed and habits have they developed? But the first thing to ask is, well, what options did they have? Did they have another option? Was it viable? Was it possible for them to do anything else, other than deny themselves? I mean, because that's the option that we're always supposedly given. No, you must deny yourself. So when someone responds with anger, or someone responds with, they break into the Man United football grounds, and apparently this is terrible violence and appalling and all these sort of stuff. But, and there's all these other ways that they could have behaved, and you think, yeah, but all those other ways are pointless. They've done nothing. So what options have you given them? You've given no option that can have an effect, and so they're taking an option that probably isn't going to have the effect that they want, but they're taking an option that has an effect, and it had a direct effect. The game was cancelled. I mean, they can see that it has an effect. And that it may not be in the long run the effect that they want, but if you don't give people an option that has an effect, then they will, when they need to, find a way of having an option that produces some kind of effect, even if that effect for everyone else, may seem like, oh, well, that's not in the long term a very, very good one, because obviously, the option that I should, shut up, starve, be quiet, that's not an option. That's suppression, that's oppression, that's repression, that's exploitation. And so I think there's a really kind of, and this comes back to some of the stuff I was talking about a couple of weeks ago when I was talking about the need to think, not necessarily positively, but less negatively about things like automata and automatisms, habits sometimes, is that there's a need to kind of think about the way in which the framework in which behaviours, experiences, and my being, the world in which I am, the world in which I exist, to think more about the wider community that's involved in that, the wider set of entities that are involved in that. And I think this speaks to why magicians and sorcerers and why machinatus use an anagram technique is one of the things that is kind of taught inside sorcery and taught inside magic, is this kind of experimental relationship to the creation of a setting, the creation of a particular framework. And so if you want to be able to achieve a certain sort of effect, or you want to maybe prevent another effect from happening that continually happens, then one of the things you want to think quite clearly about is the way in which you are setting yourself up. And so the way in which you're setting up your ritual, or you're setting up your work, or you're setting up, your belief structure, the framework in which that's taking place, and whether you want to rearrange that. And sometimes, if you feel stuck, or you're just not, you're just not quite sure what you're doing, sometimes the best way of doing that is to just sort of randomly mix shit up. It sounds terrible, but just to randomly mix shit up, to stick it out there in a kind of sort of slightly disorganized structure, allowing that randomness to feel like it's, open to the world. This can be the tarot, or this can be, you know, a set of elements in a spell working or something. But you sort of randomly mix it up, and then you carry out a process and see what happens. And that kind of iteration of reorganizing things, seeing what happens, reorganizing things, seeing what happens, relies upon beginning to be attuned to that thing intensities, that kind of sense of what does, you know, of trusting that at a certain moment there will be a kind of crystallization of something, a crystallization of a relationship to a question, or a relationship to a problem, or a relationship to a person. There'll be a kind of crystallization that enables you to feel like that there's a kind of response that you can develop. Now, it's very easy, and there's great problems here, because it's very easy to get too caught up in that, and it's very easy to sort of generate, you know, a whole series of, you know, massively problematic, you know, dynamics that can go off on all over the place, which is why quite often it's good to do these kind of things in community or with other people. But that capacity to remake the world depends upon us experimenting with the kind of elements that are put into that world. And those elements don't just include the human. They include, you know, the way we eat, the kind of things we bump into, the kind of things we walk on, the kind of things we breathe, the kind of entities that are behind us, in front of us, around us. We know this from the point at which, for example, we take ourselves out of sleeping in a house and go into a field, into a tent, and sleep in a tent. And the kind of, we know that the rearrangement of those spaces has an enormous effect. We know that if we were to go and, I think this is one of the reasons people travel, they try and rearrange their space by going to a different country. So we know this intimately, that the rearrangement of the elements of our world is as important to our freedom as any sense of, you know, my capacity or my agency or my education. But that rearrangement of the world involves also the rearrangement of our behaviours, the rearrangement of our habits, the rearrangement of those stimuluses and responses. And if we just simply think it's all to do with me, it's all to do with my willpower, it's all to do with my kind of consciousness, and we ignore all those other elements of the world, not only is that massively, massively egomaniacal, I mean, it's so self-centered as to be unbelievable in a way, but it's also, it seems, fundamentally in error. It's fundamentally going to go wrong. Anyway, I think I'm going to wander off there. Thank you very much for Machinatus for being around, and for other people that are dropping by. As I say, I'm going to continue kind of thinking with Curtis in the background, but probably going to be moving a little bit more to this stuff on Foucault and Binswanger, on dreams and imagination. If you're around and you're interested in that kind of stuff, I will find, if I can, an electronic copy, a PDF or something to put up on my Discord, because the text itself is a little bit difficult to get hold of. And obviously, people are more than welcome to, if they've got something they want to chat about, or something they want to read, or any of that sort of stuff. Monday evenings, the philosophy research discussions are a space I'm more than happy to use to talk about other things that people have in their own minds that they want to pursue or go through. Thanks very much, everybody, and I will catch you soon, and happy thinking, I suppose, or try. At least I'm in a better mood this week than I was last week. I hope some of you are. I will see you soon. Stay safe.